Hello, good day, everyone. I am Lojan B. Stampa, and I'm going to present to you what are the approaches and techniques in budgeting the Philippine setting. So, let's start. But before that, we have to see the outline of my presentation. The outline of the presentation is as follows. We start with government budgeting and its importance, approaches in government budgeting, and budgeting in the Philippines. Now, we start with the government budgeting and its importance. What is government budgeting? What is government budgeting? Now, by definition, it is the process, again, a process of allocating financial resources for intended programs, projects, services, and activities to empower the organization to carry out stated goals and objectives. Other definition is it entails management of government expenditures that will create impact from the production and delivery of goods and services while supporting a healthy fiscal position. Now it has three orientations. These three orientations is it should have control, it should have management, and it should have planning. Why? Because we're talking about budget here, and this budget is the budget for the government. So if you just handle it better, manage it well, you can carry out the objectives of the government in order to improve the economy and serve better the people, no? While maintaining again a healthy fiscal position. That means like whatever the control, the management or the planning is, it should always be optimistic or has a positive effect for the economy and for the people. Okay, let's proceed. Why is government budgeting important? Government budgeting is important because it enables the government to plan and manage its financial resources. Again, manage its financial resources to support the implementation of various programs and projects that best promotes the development of the country. Again, so if you just manage it well, if you just manage it smoothly, your finances automatically it will give us an idea that it will also generate best practices and promotes development of the country. Now, the other reason is that government can prioritize and put into action its plans, programs, and policies within the constraint of its financial capability as dictated by economic conditions, because maybe the economic condition of a government or any given country may be progressive or maybe declining or maybe worse or getting better. So we are only as strong as our finances. So we have to manage it well and answer based on the condition of our economy. Okay? So that is how important government budgeting is. Okay, let's proceed. So we now go to the approaches in the government budgeting. To start with, we have this line item budgeting. Line item budgeting or LIB. It is a manifestation of process, budgetary, incremental, fragmented, and non-programmatic and sequential. So the best keywords there are that it's incremental and fragmented, meaning that because of that, it has the advantage of easy budgeting because it is usually based on historical expenditures as recorded in previous years. So whenever you do line item budgeting, you can always refer to the previous records or the previous files that you can see in the office or any documentation previously being handled by the previous administrators or the previous personnel before you. Now, and with that, it is easy to justify the expenditures, straightforward, simple to administer, and readily understood. But it has also the disadvantage of the broad expenditure categories used in a line item budget make it difficult to set service priorities because of many fragmentation, many incrementation. It develops the disadvantage that it might be too many categories or sometimes it is too broad, no? So that makes it difficult to set service priorities or what do we really need to put our budget into, no? So there's sometimes an issue about prioritization. Okay, the next part is performance budgeting or PB. The keyword here is activity or functional budgeting, which means objects of expenditures are deemed as significant factors in relation to what they used for and not in relation to their specific character. With that, it has the advantages of it makes possible the submission and consideration of budget for a shorter length of time. It enables administrators to place responsibility upon subordinate officials for the clear execution of the provisions made by the legislative body. Okay, and the disadvantages is lacks or absence of performance measures, personal processing, technical skills, and competencies. So from the keyword itself, performance budgeting focuses more on the nature of the activity, like the functional characteristics of an activity, no, which makes it easily implemented in terms of a shorter length of time. But sometimes, if there are no specific performance indicators or performance measures, it will be very difficult to account, like as to how the budget is being enacted upon. Okay, focus on activity is good, but if you don't have specific indicators or performance measures, then that would be to your disadvantage. Okay, so let's proceed. Now, we now proceed to planning, programming, and budgeting system, PPBS. No? It provides a strong linkage between planning and budgeting. The scheme requires agency managers to identify program objectives, develop measuring program output. Now, here's the keyword here, no? Calculate total program cost over the long run. Prepare detailed multi-year program and financial plans, analyze cost, benefits, and look for alternative program designs. So I think just by definition alone, and you see the keywords here, the calculate total program cost, long run, detailed multi-year program, and alternatives. So this kind of budgeting system is obviously very tedious and requires very much details, no? Because aside from setting up one format or one phase, it needs several designs. So you just cannot design just one design. It needs several alternative designs so that at least you can analyze in terms of cost and benefit which among these designs is the best for implementation. Okay, and with that, it has the advantages of it offers logical, objective approach and clear linkage between planning and budgeting. It allows administrators to evaluate anticipated results of proposed programs and systems, alternatives, and to compare results from different proposals. Now, the disadvantage here is that it's only a tool and never makes a decision. You make the decision yourself, no? And it might bring a damaging gap between publicity and performance. Okay, so that is PPBS. Detailed, many alternatives, long run, you analyze costs, but at the end of the day, you call the shot even though it has many details, no? So that is for PPBS. Now, for the zero-based budgeting, it is an operating, planning, and budgeting method which requires every agency manager to justify his entire budget. No? Systems in detail and transfers the burden of proof to each manager. Why he or she should spend any money, it requires yearly analysis, evaluation, and justification of each activity, program, or project starting from zero performance level, a budget based on need, not want. So the advantages here is that the most important programs and projects are allocated enough funding rather than distribute the resources thinly among the many activities and achieve nothing in the end. So for the zero-based budgeting, since it is zero-based and then it really calls for prioritization. So that means if you have like several things that needs budgeting or several regions or assignments or organizations, applications, with zero-based budgeting, you need to allocate enough funding for those very important programs first. And maybe majority of the funds will be allocated within these very important programs. The effect is that only a small amount of the budget will then be appropriated to other programs. But at least the advantage is that the most important ones, as being decided by the government, are being given with an ample and appropriate amount. Okay. Now, the disadvantage is that insufficient training of agency personnel, it might lack of guidance in implementation, and emphasis on forms or too much paperwork. Okay, so that is also the those were also the disadvantages of ZBB, the zero-based budgeting. No? So now we proceed with the budgeting in the Philippines. No? So with all those approaches in budgeting, we now look with our the Philippine experience. No? Let's say for the last three presidents, we need to look like how they do the budgeting during their administration. So let's look budgeting in the Philippines and what were practiced. So I'm going to present to you how budgeting was practiced by President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, President Benigno Pinoy Aquino III, and President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. Okay, so let's see how these three presidents they might have some similarity, or are they totally different in the management and implementation of budget during their administration. So let's proceed. We start with President Arroyo. President Arroyo, during her time, her declaration is that the country was on the verge of fiscal crisis and budget deficit is the most urgent problem. Like the country, economic-wise and budget-wise, is in the state of crisis. So with that, her key principle is that fiscal strength should be restored. Fiscal strength should be restored because we have a crisis in terms of finance. And then with that, she used the public expenditure management, PEM, where the outcomes is that it aggregates fiscal discipline, which means spending with means. Allocative efficiency, that means spending on the right priorities. And operational efficiency, which means spending with value for money. Okay, so these are her declaration, key principle, and the outcomes. Now, let's look forward to more details. Now, for more details, President Arroyo also utilized the medium-term expenditure framework, or MPEF. It's an analytical tool, uses 6-year fiscal plan of projected revenues and deficit targets. It uses forward estimates to show baseline cost of continuing existing policies. Significant share of the budget is accounted for by capital projects. So there are several projects, but she identified main capital projects in her time. And the characteristic for this is that there is a high degree of flexibility is permitted in the implementation of the budget, both to claw back the expenditures again, because again there is a financial crisis as declared by her during her time. So we need to claw back and gain some momentum also, in view of actual revenue receipts and because of extensive in-year reallocations. Now the great importance is thus placed being integrated into the same units that deal with the annual budgeting rather than being placed in a special unit. Now, she also utilized the paper on budget strategy. As you can see, the priority sectors, for the use of new resources, especially her capital projects and capital priorities, are all about education. Top one, education, and then health, and then infrastructure development. Education, health, infrastructure development, and eventually she included agriculture as number 4 and welfare as number 5. So that is how President Arroyo managed the government budget during her time. Okay, MPEF and paper on budget strategy, or PBS. Now let's proceed. How about President Pinoy Aquino? So during his time, his declaration is that use the Matuwid budget for inclusive development. Then his key principles is that link budgets to agency performance, hold agencies accountable for delivering their targets using their budgets, and agencies are required to publish key budget information and reports through their respective websites. So President Aquino is also, during his time, the transparency seals were imperative to all government organizations, all government companies, and this seal should be seen in their websites, no? So this is his legacy, the Philippine Transparency Seal, no? Making the budget um, public, especially the transactions, and so that the people can access it for information and to also check the accountability of these respective government offices. Okay, so to go into further details, President Pinoy used the Performance-Informed Budgeting, or PIB. It's a publication of performance information in the budget documents. It strengthens the accountability of government for spending with measurable results. Again, because of the enhanced transparency and accountability in the allocation of limited resources. Now, he also used the bottom-up budgeting. Now, the bottom-up budgeting is a demand-driven budget planning process. It institutionalizes people's participation in the budget process to gain a better understanding of their needs and requirements and ensure that these are met. Now, the final output to be produced by local communities composed of equal representations. And because of this, it empowered people through their tighter prioritization of their needs, faster delivery of results, and more open budget process. No? So the keyword here is that President Pinoy had this bottom-up budgeting in order to empower also the people. No, those in terms of hierarchy, those people in the bottom, no, the LGUs, to say their concern, and in order also to expedite the distribution of budgets for these people, he used the bottom-up budgeting. Okay, so those were the budgeting approach, no, during the time of President Aquino. More on transparency in terms of accountability and the bottom-up budgeting, no, meaning involved it more flexible, involving the people in the bottom side of the hierarchy, specifically the LGUs, to also share their concerns and participate in the budgeting process. Okay, hey, let's proceed. Let's proceed to our to President Duterte during his time. During his time, the declaration is a budget for real change, and with that, the budget for real change, his key principles are that credible and disciplined fiscal policy, fiscal space focused on equitable and social order, and budget reflecting our policies. With this, it's strengthening transparency. So he also adopts the transparency of President Aquino, participation and accountability. Now, enhancing partnerships also with local governments to ensure sustainable development. So, proceeding further, what President Duterte used is program convergence budgeting, PCB, but looking at its nature, it's just an enhanced form of PIB. Now, as we know, the PIB is the one being embraced by President Aquino. So, President Duterte just enhanced it in his time. So, in terms of definition, it is an approach to facilitate and incentivize coordination. Now, the keyword here, no, facilitate and improvise or incentivize coordination between agencies on priority interagency program, sustaining cooperation. No, coordination happens, and then there is cooperation between agencies in the development and implementation of priority programs, no, ensuring collaboration and coordination among all participating agencies. Now, also, during his time, it's all about PREXI. No? The PREXI is it stands for Program Expenditure Classification. It's a framework used for expenditure management, directing resources towards results and accounts for performance by identifying major final outputs. It reflects in the budget the link between strategies, budgets, and results, and facilitates the monitoring and evaluation of programs with the performance indicators attached to each program. Restructures an agency's budget to group all recurring activities as well as projects under appropriate programs or key strategies. Okay, so President Duterte used the PCB, again, as a summary, Program Convergence Budgeting, and the PREXI, Program Expenditure Classification within this PCB style of budgeting. So that's it, no? That's it, how President Duterte managed the government finance during his time. Okay, now let's proceed. Let's now go to the budgeting in the Philippines, looking at the process. Okay, what's the process of budgeting in the Philippines? Okay, so now let's try to discover it. Now it all begins with step one. The president submits a budget request. Okay, the president submits a budget request. Step two, the House of Representatives and Senate of the Philippines pass budget resolutions based on the budget request of the president. And after that, still in the Senate and the House of Representatives, they create appropriation bills with these budget resolutions. Okay, from budget resolutions, appropriation bills are created, but it may take several. No, there may be several appropriation bills, so that's why they have to prioritize. So for step four, they vote for appropriation bills. So they select those that really needs to be prioritized, no? Because during the creation of appropriation bills, it may be this may be too many. So you have to select, you have to vote which are the top priorities. And after that, they endorse it to the president, in which for the final step, the president then signs each appropriation bill. Again, those appropriation bill being voted mutually by the House and the Senate, and then with that, with the signing of the president with each appropriation bill, the budget then becomes law. Okay, so typically the budgeting involves the office of the president, and then as office of the president then goes to the House of Representatives and the Senate, and after that it goes back to the president for the culmination. Okay, so that is how budgeting process in the Philippines happens. Okay, so now let's proceed now to the budgeting in the Philippines. What are the characteristics that needs to be focused? Because again, we're speaking here about government money, so we need to know what are the characteristics or the things that we always have to put in mind while doing the budgeting process. No, so let's proceed. So the first is that it should have a commitment to fiscal discipline. A commitment to fiscal discipline, which means that you should develop discipline during the budgeting process, because as we know, the Philippines has a big or a huge debt, no, to other countries, to the international bank, no. So borrowing money and then trying to capitalize it to improve the economy, it needs to have a very good impact and output, so that at least if we can have savings or we can have some extra income, then along the way we can gradually pay this debt that we have, no, for so many years. And part also of that is if you manage with fiscal discipline your government resources, then that might also increase, no, the Philippines gross domestic product performance, no, the GDP, the gross domestic product performance, which is a very important indicator as to how we assess the economic condition of our country. Okay, so we need to improve GDP, and by that you need to have fiscal discipline. Okay, now proceeding to the next. Next is that as much as possible during the budget processing, it should be tax compliance and corruption free. Okay, so we have this money, we manage it, we allocate it to different offices to manage different services, but along the way we try to avoid corruption along the way. No, it should be corruption free and tax compliant. And with that, I think the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the BIR, and the COA, the Commission on Audit, will work hand in hand to guide also in terms of accountability and processing about how these government funds were being spent by several offices, no? By the government officials, by the government employees. With that, we need to ensure that the budgetary management of our government funds should have always be, no, tax compliant and corruption free. Okay, so again, next is it should subsidize to government owned and controlled corporations. So as we know, the government also owns several corporations in which it also expects several or substantial amount of income. No, so in terms of budgeting, the grand budget, the government also should look to the companies that they own. No? For example, the government owns the National Power Corporation and the National Food Authority. They should also allocate or subsidize an ample amount, no, or considerable amount for this to continue operating, because as by default, these are government-owned and controlled corporations. Again, these are strategically owned by the government in order to serve better the people in the country. Okay, so that's why it is also a top characteristic that we need to consider during the budgetary process or budget management. Now, it should have the characteristic that it is aligned to the national planning function. So as you know, sometimes each president in the Philippines has 6 years of administration. So the president usually use several catchphrases or keywords in order to showcase or send the message to the people, like what is he planning or what is she planning in order for the country to progress. No, so with that there is what we call the national planning function. No, so like for example, if you look at the news today or in any documents or any media, you might encounter the term the Philippine Development Plan or the ambition natin in 2040. Okay, so again, the budgeting should be guided with the national planning function. At least we are looking forward to the future, that we are attesting that we are budgeting we are budgeting this money, this government money, aligned, constructively aligned to the vision that what we are looking forward for our country. Obviously, that's towards progress, no? Especially for the way of living for the Filipino people, and of course for the economy to be better and to foster along the way. Okay. Next is there are unprogrammed funds and special purpose funds, no, that needs to be managed well by the government. Now, the challenging part of these unprogrammed funds and special purpose funds is sometimes it is very difficult to be spent or to be spent or appropriated, because these funds can only be accessed or implemented if for some special scenarios or from special conditions that needs to be met first before these funds are released. No, like for example, there should always be a contingency fund. Like for example, there should be a fund. Like for example, a sudden pandemic will happen. No, like for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. So at least if the government beforehand have prudently managed the government funds, then maybe it would not be very difficult for the country to face the pandemic, because beforehand, in a prudent way, they have already appropriated special funds for these scenarios. And also, for example, if there's a disaster, there's a typhoon, so we expect that those are calamities, no? So special purpose funds, no, should be allocated also for those unexpected moments, no? And with that, I think sometimes also if you hear the word pork barrel, no, as attested by politicians, that sometimes the main purpose of pork barrel is to accelerate, no, if ever a politician or a senator or a congressman will want to have some special projects in his region or in her region, so the pork barrel might help, no? Again, it is again subjected again to the special conditions that needs to be met. That's why it's called special purpose funds, no? And with that, I think you also hear the word PDAF. It means Priority Development Assistance Fund. So it might be a new term, but if you look into it, it's like an upgraded or newer version of a pork barrel. Okay, so again, it's part of programming the government budget. Even though we try to allocate funds appropriately to explicit regions, explicit services, or already identified beforehand na the priorities, but sometimes in the future you don't know what will happen. Like for example, calamities, or maybe suddenly something will happen in your region that needs automatic release of funds because so you have to put premium also with the characteristic no of putting special purpose funds during the management of government funds. Okay, so unprogrammed funds and special purpose funds need also to be considered. Okay, so this is with that no sometimes corruption in any form can happen during the budgetary process, but good to know no that this is the last special characteristic or the characteristic that needs to be focused during government fiscal management is that the creation of the Development Budget Coordination Committee, or the DBCC. So it is composed of the Department of Budget and Management, Department of Finance, NEDA, the National Economic and Development Authority, and the Office of the President. So this is a committee of 4 agencies, the DBCC. So the Department of Budget and Management is for the resource allocation and management. The Department of Finance is for the revenue generation and debt management. And the National Economic and Development Authority is for the overall macroeconomic policy. And then the Office of the President is for the presidential oversight. No, so technically, it is very challenging to manage or process the government funds. No, but with this creation of Development Budget Coordination Committee, or the DBCC, DBM, the Department of Finance, NEDA, and the Office of the President will work hand in hand to make sure that these funds will be processed appropriately, will go to the appropriate budgetary allocations, and they also have to make sure that these funds will be accounted for, so that at least the government can serve better the people, and also for the economy again to always progress and to always rise in order to increase the way of living or to improve the way of living of the people in the Philippines. Okay, so that's it. And that's my presentation. I hope you've learned something about approaches and techniques in budgeting the Philippine setting. I'm Rajan Vistampa, and thank you very much for listening. God bless us all.